Solitary confinement is terrifying, especially if you are innocent of the charges that put you there. It evokes a lot of emotion. For me, being in prison in solitary confinement was terrible. It was a nightmare. My soul still cries from all that I witnessed and endured. It mourns continuously. It takes every scrap of humanity to stay focused and sane in that environment. I should be anything but what I am today. But sometimes the spirit is stronger than the circumstances.
Some got 6 months, some got solid year. But me and my buddy, we got lifetime, yeah. Some got 6 months, some got 1 solid. But me and my buddy, we got lifetime here. Take myself, baby. Let me go to bed.
My name is Robert King, sometimes also known as Robert King Wilkerson. My name was Robert King Wilkerson for about maybe 58 years until I was released. In 2001, February the 8th, after 31 years in prison and 29 in solitary confinement. Also, I'm the only freed member of what has become known as the Angola 3. The other 2 members, Herman Wallace and Woodfox, they remain in prison now in solitary confinement, convicted for a crime that neither committed. My story did not begin with Angola 3. This is the lady who raised me, my grandmother, Alice King. I was raised by a grandmother. My mother, barely above a teenager when I was born. She brought me back to her mother, who at the time was living in Gonzales, Louisiana. After my grandmother died, I kind of got off into the system a little bit, you know, the house being broken. And then I was carted off to reformatory. I think my journey kind of continued because about a year after my release from State Industrial School for Colored Youth, I was arrested. At the time, if you was arrested, they could hold you up to 15 months or 2 years. And they would, you know, offer you a deal to plead guilty, and if you pled guilty, they'll clean the book. So this robbery is solved. But anyway, 4 people ended up pleading guilty to it, and I was one of those people, and I ended up pleading guilty to a 10-year sentence in Louisiana State Prison at Angola, Louisiana. My first trip to Angola, and despite my not having any type of politically awareness at this particular time, like I said, this was really in 1961, I kind of got the idea that I was cast back into a time that you only read about in books.
Well, early in the morning when I rise, I got a hurt in my right side. In the morning when I rise, I got a hurt in my right side. In the morning. Pick 'em up.
You got 2 cents an hour for your labor. You work sometimes 17 hours a day, depending on the time. If it was sugarcane season, and if you worked in the field, you was unfortunate enough to work in the field at that time, then you work about 17 hours a day, because at this particular time, sugarcane was the main crop. About 85 to 90% of the population was African American. At the time, it was strictly ran by a white administration. There was an inmate guard system in which inmates were given the guns. They were the backbones of security, and they were given shotguns, the baseball bats, the billy club. You were treated like a slave, and for any little minor offense, you were beaten and you were brutalized. And even before I got to prison, if you, some history of Angola, it tells you about corporal punishment was something that was pretty common. In November 1965, I was released from Angola for the first time. And I had an idea to come out and back into society and get off into boxing, in which I did for a minute. Also ended up seeing a lady who I felt I'd known all my life, and we ended up marrying. And she had a son, matter of fact. That's his picture up on the wall. Of course, he's deceased now. It was about a year later, and I was arrested one night with another person who had also a prison record. If you could not associate with somebody who had been to prison, and which I thought it was ironic because most of all my uncles had been to prison, and just about everybody in my neighborhood had been to prison. So with another known felon, I was held in the parish prison for about 11 months on some phony charge. Eventually, they sent me back to Angola, and they violated me, and it was like January of '69, I was finally released from the 10-year sentence that I originally had. I was arrested about a year later on an alleged relative to an armed robbery, and even though the identification of the perpetrator didn't remotely resemble me, I was still arrested, and I was a suspect because I had been arrested already. And this took place not so much as in the neighborhood, but in a perimeter of about 5 miles. But the point is this: if you had a record, it didn't make no difference. If you lived 20 miles away from it, you was a suspect. And so I was arrested along, dragging that along with a lot of other people. And then still later, it was upgraded to an armed robbery, and I was actually charged with it. And I was being held in prison, and I didn't have any money at that time for a lawyer or anything like that. So they appointed me a lawyer. State's attorney had offered a deal if I would plead guilty to 15 years. I would go to Angola and do maybe 5 years and go home. I declined it, and I ended up going to trial. Of course, the maximum at this time had gotten up to, I think, 66 years, and then later it went up to 99 years for a first timer. I guess what they figured the 15 years that they was offering me was a drop in a bucket compared to what I would get. But anyway, I elected to go to trial, and I was found guilty, and they gave me 35 years, and it was at that time that I really began to look at the system. I started, looking at the system as being something, you hear little things, the little tidbits here and little tidbits there, and you see the discrimination that's going on, you see the subtle and not so subtle racism, you see the discrepancies that take place, and it's something happened, this epiphany, I think my epiphany came about. And at this particular time, I must admit that there was a lot going on, because this was like late 60s and early 70s. There was the protests of the Vietnam War. Students were being shot down at Kent State and Ohio State and different other places, even southern in Baton Rouge and Jackson State, Mississippi. John Kennedy was killed in 63, and then later on, Martin Luther King came on the set.
People who have stake in their society protect that society, but when they don't have it, they unconsciously want to destroy it.
He was killed, but of course before that, Malcolm was killed.
You don't need a debate. You don't need a filibuster. You need some action.
The civil rights struggle was still going on. People were speaking civil rights, and Malcolm was saying, well, if you're black in America, you don't have human rights, so how do you expect to have civil rights? And which was true. And when he brought the plight of African Americans to the United Nations, it was his idea that black people in America was not even afforded civil rights, so they could not have human rights.
Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We invested 310 years of slave labor. 310 years, every day of which your and my mother and father worked for nothing. Not 8 hours a day. There was no union in that day. They worked from sun up until sundown. From can't see in the morning until can't see at night. They never had a day off. And on Sunday, they were allowed to sit down and sing about when they die, they wouldn't be slaves no more. When they die, we are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. And because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness.
Over my head, I see trouble in the air.
After being arrested again and after being found guilty and after getting 35 years and after deciding that, you know, America, you know, I began to feel that that I owe no moral obligation to the system, sort of like the way Frederick Douglass felt when he was a slave. You know, that I had no moral obligation to a system that, you know, that was designed, you know, to oppress and to oppress certain people. I mean, to no degree, and that you have no redress. I began to look at that which was legal and that which was moral, and I began to make the equation that where at one time slavery was considered legal. I used to think that legality, when something was legal, that it was moral and wholly it was correct. But then I began to see that, well, slavery was legal. Just because it was legal does not mean that it was morally right. The Black Panther Party kind of picked up when Malcolm was killed. The Black Panther Party got the idea that, you know, slavery was never actually ended.
We got to ring 'em all day long. Oh, well, I believe I'm double Johnny boy. Oh, well, I believe I'm double Johnny boy.
Regardless of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment and even the 14th Amendment granting due process, the Black Panther Party felt that black people in this society and certain people still did not have this particular right. And I think they showed, because when they began implementing the breakfast programs and they began implementing, you know, patrolling the police and following the police who were repressing in Oakland at that time, because the Oakland police was one of the most terrorizing forces at that time. This was in 1966, and they were killing people, and especially people of African descent, like crazy.
We are organizing to stop racism. You dig it? When you stop racism, you stop brutality and murder of black people by the racist occupying army in our black community. That's what we're going to stop. What's being done to us? You dig it? Can you dig the white power structure in this racist police force and how they've escalated the situation? That before Watts there was 1,300 cops, now there's 6,000 cops patrolling black people. That in Oakland they had 350 cops just 3.5 years ago. Now they got 1,000 cops patrolling black people. San Francisco's doubled its police force, and every area, major metropolis where black people live all across this country, they've doubled, tripled, and quadrupled their police force, equipped them with tanks, all kinds. We got to stop it, brother. Let's get together and unify.
It was at this time that, the police and the establishment began looking at the Black Panther Party as being a threat, and ultimately J. Edgar Hoover, as you know, stated that the Black Panther Party was the biggest internal threat in the nation, and not because they had the audacity to exercise the right to bear arms, because the Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms, but because they had the audacity to feed the breakfast, and they implemented the breakfast program.
As you know, we have initiated a free breakfast for school children. The reason behind this is because we understand that our children go hungry, because we understand that there's a precedent. The Black Panther Party says that we're going to serve these children. We're going to feed them every morning.
Free medical testing, especially for sickle cell anemia, and for, like I said, busing program and the school program and a lot of other things that the government had alleged to be doing, slated to do for people, was denying it. So the Black Panther Party was doing this, and so this is how they became a threat. And so this was something that I kind of readily embraced. I think I had been cultivated, When they say, we want freedom, we want power to determine our destiny, we want black men to be exempt from military service, and the reason why, because you go over there and fight war, you kill other people to make other people happy, and you can't even go to a place and sit down comfortably and drink a cup of coffee, without being insulted racially, or without being saying, well, blacks are not allowed in this area. After having that history under my belt and then seeing how the Black Panther Party was able to define it, and this is how I was able to see my life as being a black person dispossessed and and being dispossessed by a system that was designed to oppress certain people. I began to see that I was connected to something that was big, huge. I began to see the connection that I had with the Kent State students who protested the wall. I think I was able to embrace the Black Panther Party. So when they said we want land-grade housing, education, clothing, and justice and peace, we want a type of education that teaches us the true nature of a decadent society, or we want an immediate end to the police brutality in the community, an end to the robbery by the capitalists. It was easy for me to kind of embrace. I ended up escaping out the New Orleans Parish Prison, feeling the way I did. I saw it as, tantamount to a slave escaping from chattel slavery. Legally, I was a slave. I didn't sneak out, I must admit. Nobody got hurt. Our idea was just to escape. I escaped, and along with 12 other people, but I think it was more than that. But I think someone saw me and dropped a nickel on me, and they came to where I was and arrested me. And I was charged with aggravated escape, and I received 8 more years. So I had a total of 43 years. I was back in the New Orleans Parish Prison, and this is when I first heard about the Black Panther Party being in New Orleans. I had heard about them before, but I didn't know that they were in New Orleans. And there was a television in the hallway. It was there mostly for the officer who was guarding us at the time. But in a regular program, and there was an interruption, and I heard the announcer pointing out that a group of militants that was held up in a house.
Although we are not nonviolent people, we will resist this by any attempt by the fascist power structure to pursue their murderous plan of genocide on the national community to combat fascism and the black people of this country by any means necessary, including revolutionary suicide. The racist pigs of New Orleans have threatened to use whatever force necessary to extract the NCCF from desired projects, from our home that was given to us by the black people of Desire. This is our home. The racist pigs are the criminals invading our community with their war machine. The slaughter of over 50 million black people during the slave days, the murders that brought tanks and machine guns into the black colony last September, killing Kenneth Bowman, wounding more than 15 people, including a 45-year-old grandmother and mother of one of our freedom fighters now held in Parish Prison.
And, you hear about a lot of, quote, shootouts that took place with the Panthers and police around the country during that time, but it was more like shoot-in.
Mr. Jad Gahuva has spoken out about the dangerous character of these extremist movements in this country. The activities are very similar to those engaged in by the communist Viet Cong in Southeast Asia. And it's interesting that these people proclaim their interest in preventing wars, and they are fostering and fomenting civil strife in this country by guerrilla warfare, very much like the communist Viet Cong in the country. We don't know the exact number, but we don't care whether they're Black Panthers or White Panthers. We just can't tolerate the disruptions of law and civil peace in this country.
It was a shootout that took place for a couple of hours, but all of them survived. There were 9 men and 3 women. And they subsequently were housed in the area where I was being kept. I ended up on a tier with Ronnie Ellsworth and another brother who was a member of the Black Panther Party named Shelley Baptiste. I was eventually accepted membership of the Black Panther Party as a result of interacting with members that I knew. And we began to do some things in prison to kind of upgrade the condition, because the condition in prison was deplorable. We used to have to fight the rats, you know, and the field rats, the mice, and then everybody else for food. It was a lot of passive protesting that we did. We went on hunger strikes and so forth. And the hunger strike, one of the hunger strike launched me along with 2 other members of the Black Panther Party to another area in New Orleans called the Annex, which it was a federal building. They used to hold federal prisoners. And they ended up sending us over there. And of course, we continued to struggle. We were over at the Annex for about 6 months. Then they sent me back to the New Orleans Parish Prison. And then Woodfox, at this particular time, who also became one of Angola 3, and he had become a member of the Black Panther Party. Herman, who had also been arrested by this time, he also came about this time. He came into contact with members of the Black Panther Party, and he was sort of a rebel too, you know. Prior to coming in contact with political awareness, I was a rebel with a cause, but without a political consciousness. And I think at this time, Herman and Albert, who also was like that, I guess it was just something that natural progression, that we probably all progressed in the same direction, and the direction was one of maybe transforming I guess the criminal mentality that someone may describe into one that is revolutionary. Then we began to act out this political consciousness, and as a result of acting out, you know, in a passive manner, we became bigger targets. They began shipping everybody out. Anybody who would protest, anybody who would demonstrate, anybody who they thought was, quote, a troublemaker, we were shipped out in huge cattle trucks and by National Guardsmen. They were our escorts to Angola. Hundreds of prisoners was being escorted daily, all night to Angola. What happened was Herman and Albert was in that group, and I was in that group as well. But I had an open charge on me. So what they did, I did not get out of what they call the admitting unit, and they sent me back to New Orleans Parish Prison. Herman and Albert, on the other hand, they were sent into the main prison population, and this is where they began to bring the idea of the Black Panthers into, because Angola, like I pointed out, it was considered the worst prison and the bloodiest prison in the nation.
Soon in the morning, you Angola bound. Oh, Angola bound. Go ahead, mother, don't worry over me.
Angola has a total of 18,000 acres. And since I say the biggest maximum security prison, it has like 5,000 inmates. And the deal is, or the idea behind Angola is that if you go to Angola, then that's your last stop. And if you go to Angola with 20 years, that's considered minimum, that's considered light. Like you probably got more than 2,000 people with natural life sentences. And if you got a natural life sentences in Angola, it means just that. You got a life sentence without the possibility of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. The other people who don't have life sentence, they have practical life sentence. The sentence is so long until they can't do the sentence. You can't do 1,700 years. And they got people who don't have anything but a straight sentence, which is, like I said, 100 years, but you're doing 98 years with good time. You get 2 years good time on 98 years. So, but I think it's more like 95% of the people will die in Angola.
Got 1 year son and I got a HBC.
It was early May '72 because it was about 2 weeks after that officer had been found slain in a dormitory. I had been gone about 6 months. Because during that time when I got back, the prison was in an uproar. I mean, they were locking people up in mass. The officer had been found slain. And they had locked up about 500 people, about all of them was black except maybe 2 or 3 of them. Herman and Albert was among that bunch, and they ended up putting me. I was in a dungeon. They said I wanted to play a lawyer for an inmate. Myself and someone else, about 3 or 4 of us, and they took and put us in a dungeon. And it was from the dungeon that you saw a lot of stuff that was going on. It was guys was running through gambit, running through batons and having their head shaved and being beaten by a litany of guards and a lot of stuff, a lot of brutality. I went to the Red Hat, the infamous Red Hat. They sent us from the man prison dungeon to the Red Hat where they used to have the chair, old Sparky. That was a place it got closed down around '74. It was a Red Hat where Charlie Frazier, if you know anything about the history of it, you probably hear about it. He was one of the ones I think was welded in the cell because he had killed a warden or captain way back in the 40s or the 50s. It was known for a lot of stuff. But anyway, this is where they sent us at. And like you was in a cell while you had a slab of concrete for a bed. You had no bed clothes, anything like that, no mattress. You had a little zinc in the cell. And you ate 2 slices of bread each meal, like in the morning and afternoon and then that evening. And you drank water from the cell, but that was it. But anyway, they put us there for a while, and then they sent me back to RSC because they had planned on classifying me. And so what they did, they sent me, and I went before classification board, and that evening, and they classified me to CCR, and that was in May 1972. And I was there from May 1972 up until February 2001 when I was ultimately released. CCR it means closed cell restricted. That's Angola version of solitary confinement. You are confined to a cell like 23 hours a day, sometimes 24. It took us about 7, 8 years to get yard privileges. They had a practice where they used to feed. We had to kind of get them to change that, to cut holes in the balls so they could put our tray. They used to just take the tray and just throw it on the floor. I mean, you was in your cell, 7 days a week, 23 hours a day. You had no access to anybody, but if you were called out or had to go to the hospital or something, you would have to automatically go through a routine ounce search. And even though you had handcuffs on they handcuffed you while you was in your cell, and when you come back, they didn't take them off until they put you back in your cell. And then where you went, they didn't take them off. You would still have to submit to it. And it was a carryover from really slavery, because that's the way they used to do it in slavery, as Woodfox pointed out, was a custom that they never completely forgotten about in Angola, which, as you know, was a slave plantation. And the majority of the people who worked there at Angola was descendants of former, people who had ran the plantation. So the practice of slavery had never stopped. And so this was one of the things that we had to deal with. And we kind of went on a passive protest, and we got kind of dealt with him passively, but we managed to get the court to agree with us that routine ounce search was something, it served no penological purpose, and that they could not do it, not routinely, for reasons that were justified, they could do it, or justifiable, they could do it, but for just reason that is something business as usual, the court kind of shot it down. It couldn't be random. While being held in CCR, an inmate was killed in self-defense by another inmate. And even though the person who had actually killed a guy in self-defense admitted that he had killed a person in self-defense, despite the fact that the officer who owned that morning saw me and didn't see me do anything, despite the fact that I had other people who stated that I didn't do anything. The state did get a person to state. It got 2 people to say that I had participated. One, his testimony was so incredible until that trial, they didn't even believe him. The other person who had lied on me stated that the warden told him that if he did not testify against me, he would be charged with it and he would be given a death sentence. Under duress, under that type of duress, he lied and said that I had participated in it. And despite the fact that there was no forensic evidence, and especially in the case of myself first, and in the case with Herman and Albert, because Herman and Albert were charged with allegedly participating in the death of a correctional officer, where no forensic evidence and no other evidence linked them to the crime, only because they were members of the Black Panther Party. Like I said, Herman, Albert, and myself, we all were, primed and geared to progress in the direction in which we did. But in the process of doing this, like I said, we paid dearly, and Herman and Albert are still paying dearly because they remain in prison now. I didn't see any extended future, In my deepest sleep, I used to moan, just realizing that I was in prison and there was a possibility I would never get out. It's horrible, my soul used to actually literally cry. Real soulful crying tears. And I used to hear myself in my sleep in mourning, from a deep sleep, because somewhere in the reservoir of my consciousness I known, even in subconscious state, I knew where I was. I was like in the pit of hell. And I can understand how people in prison with no hope, how they could want to cling to a certain amount of hope. And this is, who was it, Marx that said, religion is the opium of the people. And in this sense, you can see it has become the opium of prison.
Those who are the worst off are those who do not receive him, because God is available to every man.
This is decreed. They accepted the fact that this is something that was decreed by the Almighty, and they have embraced this, and it's easier. This is their reality. I guess this is their adjustment. This is their way they use to not just assimilate, but to maintain sanity within this confinement. I was being held in a spot where I could not exercise the right of the slave to flee. So I imagine I did it in a different way. I got off into law. I learned about something that I really hate. There were many ways to fight a struggle, fight a battle. And so I started kind of challenging the conditions. And so I began filing pro se and kept my case open. I didn't catch that.
Are they you gonna get a chance to go back and say goodbye to everybody?
Yeah. It's midnight tonight or sometime tomorrow. I thought I had said my goodbye. Yeah. I'm a free spirit, and even though I could allow my person to be contained. My thoughts could never be contained, and I needed to catch up. I needed my body to catch up with my thoughts, And I never once gave up the idea. I knew it was a possibility I would die in prison, but I never gave up the idea that I would never get out of prison, that I would be in prison all the rest of my life. I always felt that, and then I had dreams, and then I had hopes, and then I had nightmares too, but then I had some, there were some things that some things you feel, and you kind of just keep going, keep putting one foot beyond the other one, and eventually you'll get there. I ain't gonna fall. All right. the last moment was I was talking with Herman in front of his cell. So the last few moments, I spent, you know, in front of his cell, just talking to him, you know, and just talking about the possibility of what could happen. And I had already said that even though I would be free of Angola, Angola would never be free of me. That was in my mind. And I didn't want to, I wasn't going to spend time convincing him that I was going to do this. I let him know that I don't know what I'm going to do, but I do know one thing. I'm not going out there and live no sedated lifestyle, not after having lived under these conditions, man. I said I would be consider myself a fake. When the officer called my name and said, "Hey, old timer, you ready to go?" I said, "You going home today?" I said, "Oh man, don't be playing. No, I ain't going to tell him more." He said, "You going home today? You ready?" I said, "Yeah, I'm ready to go." So he said, and so they had a captain, which was pretty cool. He came on. He had heard about the case, the A3 case, and he knew Albert was on the other side. He did something that he really wasn't supposed to do until a major came and told him. But he allowed me to walk around all the unit and holler at all the fellas and giving them the high five and let them know I won't forget them. They brought me. After I said goodbye to everybody, I went to that RSC, receiving center, and I went to check out. They processed me out, and so after about 31 years, 29 now, they gave me a $10 check. They said the reason they was keeping 10. They say because it was a court order and it wasn't a discharge, so they didn't have a chance to process. All they owed me was $20. And I walk out the gate in the midst of a group of people who was there waiting, and they was cheering, and it felt real good. Sort of surreal, but surreal good. I'm thinking this, that once I got off into Christianity, I think if they would have released me 6 months after I was off into Christianity, I don't think they would ever had any more trouble out of me. I think they overkept me because I learned more than Christianity. I learned that, and then I went beyond, and I began to learn more, and I began to see that. And like Job, I began to question and go outside. I began to think outside the box. You know, the fact that I did not get out in 6 months, I'm sort of glad, because I think I would have lived in a box all my life. I would have lived a life and never really fully understood what life was about, because I have managed to go outside of the United States many times over. I've been to 15, 20 different countries, some 2-3 times over, and I've seen the, life on a much broader scale. I've seen people act on a much, broader perception basis. My life would have went totally different if they would have let me out. I probably would have been a great preacher, I use that in quotation, and preaching the word of God, But the point is this, that did not happen. So I guess I'm still a preacher of salt, and the type of thing that I do is something that I think is righteous. It's the right thing to do, because I wouldn't want nobody to go through the thing that I went through, the unjust measures that I've had in my life. I wouldn't want to see this happen to anybody. So and if I could do something about it, doing what I'm doing, then the way I'm doing it, the purpose for being here, I think I'm fulfilling that. And I don't have to do that in a box. And I think there's a certain religion that put people in a box. And I refuse to be placed in a box. I refuse to stay in a box.
First time in trouble, I didn't get no fair trial at all. Oh, Lord. Seems like to me, baby, they like poor boy child.
you know, the people who are at the bottom of the heap, I think they have to scream the loudest. They have to make the most noise in order to be heard. And this is the only way you can be heard. So I'm saying this, that we are, you know, we're optimistic that Herman and Albert will be released, but it will be as a result of a combination of things, and it will be because this case has been fought in the court of public opinion as well as the court of legal opinion. And I think the two are complementary. They are not antagonistic at all of each other.